Hello and welcome to the Swine Disease Reporting System. This is the podcast for the report 26, which has data until March of 2020. Today we have a special guest with us, Dr. Melissa Hensch from Ashoff's, and we are going to talk about her experiences, and she's willing to share with us her perspectives on mycoplasma pneumonia elimination, diagnostics, and prevention from in breeding herds. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, it's great to be here today. I hope to help provide you a little bit of perspective on some of what we do within the system as well as our work on mycoplasma.
Excited to have you in the podcast today, and excited to talk about mycoplasma and other stuff. But first, we're going to start as usual in the first page. We talked about PRRS detection by PCR. Giovanni Edison, the summary of this page here, long story short, is everything is following the predicted bands. So in other words, PRRS detection by PCR is within what was expected for this time of the year in all age categories, right?
That's correct, Dr. Linhares. The forecast is following those predicted levels. We see some detection in adult sow farm that was above the encounter for the month of March since 2013, and this level of detection that was that we see during 2020 is not surprising by our advisory group, since this is expected by the climate condition that we have during winter months, and sow farms continue to see some rebreaks. There is the virus that's continue residing in some herds. And additionally to that, there is some perception of some strains like the 174, 184s, whatever, that they are seeing that the virus is keeping resilient in the herds and taking a longer time to eliminate, contributing for these levels of detection.
Melissa, what are your take home from this page, and also more specifically on this perception that some are sharing, that some PRRS isolates, most of them sharing those either 174 or 184 cut pattern, a perception that they are more resilient in the sense that it's taking longer to eliminate them from infected breeding herds.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, in that they do seem to take much longer from an elimination standpoint. The other thing I would throw on there, and I think it's going to correlate to a little bit of our discussion on mycoplasma as well, is better monitoring tools. We are doing more processing fluids than we ever have, and so we are finding these staying out in the herds much longer than expected because we're testing to a much higher level. We're identifying a much lower prevalence than we ever used to be able to identify. So I think you couple that with some more resilient viruses that it's certainly taking longer to eliminate, and we're having winter breaks drag on into March. So I'm not surprised to see these numbers at all.
Mm-hmm. So just a combination of virus isolates with the ability to persist longer and better detection tools in those viruses, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So moving on to the coronavirus stage, detection of PED, Delta coronavirus, and TGE by PCR. Similar to what we reported in the first page, the detection patterns here are following the predicted band, so no signals at this point. Anything else worth to mention, Giovanni?
No, that's it. The only point that if you look for the first two charts in top, we have more number of cases being tested for PED and Delta coronavirus. And this basically, we have been discussing in previous reports that there is some change in the field conditions where some systems are monitoring more wing to finish animals. So that was expected to be occurring at this moment, since there is this changing observed over there.
Melissa, any additional comments on this, on coronavirus detection by PCR?
No, it's really within expected amount for time of year.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we personally have had a handful of those breaks, not unexpected relative to just time of year and timeline. And there is a significant amount out there that are now starting to test and finishing and monitor. You know, again, tying into we're monitoring more often, we're testing a little bit more often, because we now have a more endemic pathogen where we can actually go understand where that prevalence is, and how we can impact that. So that's where some of that finishing testing comes from.
I see. All right. So moving on to the Mycoplasma pneumonia page, where it reports detection by PCR testing. And the detection curve is also following the predicted pattern for this time of the year. The only detail here that it was expected for Mycoplasma to increase the detection between weeks 15 and 20 of the year, and we are at the weeks seeing data here until week 13, and we are already seeing some indication of increased detection, still within the band, the forecast band, but with some trend for detection here, especially from samples coming from sow farms. Right, Giovanni?
Yeah, that's correct. And this increased detection was observed basically by increased testing in suckling piglets. And what the advisor group has pointed out was that the production systems are choosing between eliminate the agents from the herds or establish positive immunized herds to survive with the agent. Either way, more monitoring has been done to take science-driven decisions to choose the path that they prefer.
And that's certainly something new, right, Melissa? Testing more frequent testing of suckling pigs for Mycoplasma.
Yeah, that would be a little bit more of a newer development. Again, as we improve our testing capabilities on what sample we're using and how we're doing it, you're seeing a lot more detection. We're actually able to do tracheal bronchial swabs on a much broader population more consistently, and as systems continue to choose whether they either stabilize or eliminate, both of those would require a fair amount of testing to be successful. And so as we improve the way we test, we detect it quite a bit more.
And you guys have been particularly or relatively to the rest of the industry, at least to the folks that we've been talking with, you guys have been relatively aggressive on Mycoplasma elimination, right? Really moving to eliminate Mycoplasma from the herd as opposed to leaving and controlling. What has been the motivation behind that decision to eliminate Mycoplasma in the system from breeding herds?
Yeah, that's correct. We've been very aggressive with it. I would say almost to the exclusion of all else. We have eliminated it in almost all of our herds, or some would be on that pathway. And really it comes down to a financial decision. Mycoplasma is something that we've been able to very consistently control, as well as keep out of our herds. And so if that's a piece that and a lever we can go pull in that PRDC complex, it's one that we can be very successful in. We've looked at it from about $4 to $5 a pig. When you couple mortality, culls, med cost, average daily gain, and feed conversion, that $4 to $5 a pig is absolutely real. And so we've got that, and we've got the tools in our toolbox to successfully eliminate it. That's $4 to $5 a pig I can go after, and I can eliminate from my PRDC complex. I may not be as successful on managing influenza, for example, but if I can manage a Mycoplasma, I'm absolutely going to go after that one. And I tell you, we do feel like that $4 to $5 has been real. We absolutely have captured that return on investment, because it isn't free to do an elimination program, nor is it free to stabilize your herds. It does cost money and time and a lot of people from the execution standpoint, but it absolutely does pay back.
And that $45 per pig is from winter market.
That's correct. Yes. And we, from a system standpoint, would own all of our pigs all the way through. There's obviously a lot of variability within the industry on how those pigs are managed and who owns what where, and who's going to capture that. So a lot of how people are making that decision is obviously going to be based on how they're structured from a system standpoint and a sales standpoint on who's going to capture that $4 to $5 per pig.
Okay. And so one of the, when you go start a plan to eliminate a disease, mycoplasma is no different. One of the key aspects is having a good diagnostic or good monitoring tool to differentiate between positive, negative. Mycoplasma is not as straightforward as some other pathogens like PER. So what can you share with us about what have you been using and how comfortable you are with procedures to detect mycoplasma pneumonia in those herds undergoing elimination?
Yeah, that's a good question. And over the course of the years, I'll kind of take you through our pathway here. Originally, we would have been looking at utilizing laryngeal swabs, a sentinel program, for example, where you have a vaccine negative pig and you enter them into the herd to understand your status, and utilizing ELISAs. And it was very, very cumbersome, and the results were not consistent. We didn't understand it enough. And so we have now moved to exclusively deep tracheobronchial swabs. And so we are doing that and having much better consistent detection at an earlier stage. So we would utilize those swabs both from establishing a day 0 if you're doing an elimination to understand how quickly can I get my gilt population positive, as well as understanding the sow herd status. So that's where you see within the report where if we've had increases on sow herd testing, that could be piglet testing, that could be gilts that are in the farm. We've been doing those swabs on all of them. And then probably the other big change, I think, from a testing standpoint has been on the back half of the closure. When you close a farm for a certain number of weeks, you throw a medication and a vaccination program on there, all meant to really knock that bug down. There's been a lot of question on how long does it take to confirm whether we were successful or not. We have had farms go easily about 12 months of entering naives before we are able to detect it. And when we're using tracheobronchial swabs, often if we're repeatedly testing, for example, every month on those elimination farms, we will detect it before we've seen clinical signs in those gilts. It is a very, very good diagnostic. It's been challenging, I think, for people to learn how to get it because it is a technical skill that you have to acquire and learn, but it's highly, highly effective once you can get there.
And how do you use it? For example, for PERS, if we step back, it's most people work under the assumption that if you want to test a breeding herd, you go for the suckling pig population, you test a subset of those for mycoplasma. Do you still need to test the sows, or is it okay to focus on the suckling pigs only? And if so, how many do you typically sample to give you enough confidence that if everything is negative, you're good enough, that it's comfortable enough that the disease is not there, the pathogen is not there?
Yeah, so on a herd we're trying to detect it, typically we've gone for our best sample being gilts that have been on farm for at least 90 days, ideally. So these would be animals that we had confirmed negative prior to entry. Either they're being received from a multiplication unit that is testing regularly, and then they would be tested prior to shipment. And so we've got a negative animal, regardless of whether they're vaccinated, which most of ours will be vaccinated. We would go after the gilts that have been entered into that herd. And typically we'll go for either a sample of 30 or 60. The true academic answer is, in order to really detect mycoplasma at a very low level, it's much more than 30 or 60 animals. But we feel confident that if you take that as well as over time, so for example, if you just completed elimination, you're going to wait about 6 months, and then you're going to go in quarterly and test 30 of those gilts that have now been in there for at least 90 days. So once a quarter, you go in and you take 30 gilts, and eventually, if that farm does have any mycoplasma floating around, those are your first animals that will pick it up because they are truly negative. They may be vaccinated, but you will still absolutely pick it up from those.
I see. And you mentioned earlier about testing some of the suckling pigs. In which situation do you sample those piglets?
We've sampled suckling pigs when we're trying to determine true impact in wean to market. If we're trying to make a decision on, for example, utilizing an antibiotic at weaning to control it, because as you go through eliminations as well as stabilization, there is a period of time where you may still be shedding into those wean pigs. And if we can determine how much, if they are, for example, 50% or more positive, we're going to implement some sort of an intervention process there to manage the downstream mortality. So it really more so gives us a knowledge of what to expect in those pigs and how to go after it and wean to market from an intervention standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so, and if we go back a little bit on the disease elimination procedure, you did mention about herd closure and medication. And what are the other kind of, say, big picture about the disease elimination plan to get rid of mycoplasma from your breeding herd?
Sure. So we've had a lot of lessons learned on this. The first one would be day zero. And what I mean by day zero is when you close a herd, you are going to ensure that all of that gilt population is 100% exposed because you don't want a negative animal entered into a positive herd and have her see it, for example, a month later. So establishing day zero by means of exposing your gilt population and then testing them to ensure how long did it take them to go positive, which can be variable depending on what method you use to expose and strain, for example. Typically it's 4 to 6 weeks, but we will test very heavy to determine day zero. And then we utilize a combination of both time and medication. And those can be extremely variable. There's no one size fits all, both from a closure time standpoint as well as a medication. And then we would also utilize some vaccines in there. There's no right or wrong answer. You're going to go out there and find 50 different ways to eliminate the bug, both from a time or medication standpoint. I think what's important on making those decisions is determining your tolerance for risk. What is your tolerance for risk of a failure? And how much do you want to spend to do that? I mean, we've got programs anywhere from $10 to $40 per sow. They've all either had successes or failures. On the more expensive side, both from a time and a medication standpoint, yes, you can increase your chances of success. At the end of the day, even the ones where we have failed, that ROI on the money that you spent is still there because you come off of a closure and a medication plan with a much more stable herd, even if you weren't successful. So there's a lot of inner workings on there, and you've really got to determine what is the best fit scenario for both your system and the farm.
And that's a good, that's a great point that maybe you didn't truly eliminate the pathogen for good, but if you economically stabilize the herd, right? If you stabilize the herd enough, you reach an economic kind of elimination, at least for a while. How long does it take since the herd is negative or clinically stable to get that return of investment back? Is it a year? Is it 2?
No, the return on investment is fairly rapid. You know, it's obviously that $4 to $5 per pig, and how long that lasts. I mean, it can typically you're going to return that within the first 6 months. It's pretty fast. You don't need, because even if you fail, right? If you come back as positive between 9 and 12 months post closure, you still have all of those pigs on feed that are negative. And to be honest, that 9 or 12 months post-closure, you're still weaning pigs at that point, even if you start to detect it at that point, at a very low prevalence. And so those pigs perform exceptionally well, as if they were almost negative, even though you know you have a prevalence in those pigs. So you can capture that ROI fairly rapidly and then extend it, even if you were not successful, for a good 12 months post-closure before you really start to see an increase in prevalence in the wean pig and therefore an impact in your finishing performance. So it's a pretty long road as far as capturing that.
Well, yeah, it's a great lesson. And how do you keep those herds negative? Once you go negative, now you have, so once you eliminate the mycoplasma, now you want to make sure that they keep negative. What are your lessons on take homes on biosecurity practices to keep the herd negative?
So any good veterinarian would probably not be saying this right now, so I probably shouldn't, but knock on wood, we have had no lateral breaks in any of our sow farms. We have had a fair amount where we had for example, a cheaper medication program and we were not successful on elimination. But we have not laterally broken, meaning brought any mycoplasma into the sow farms. It's not an easy bug to move like you would think of from a PRRS or a flu perspective. And so when it comes to biosecurity and keeping it out, if you're executing on all of your other things that would keep PRRS and flu out, you will be successful in keeping mycoplasma out. Now, on the flip side, the best way to move mycoplasma into your herd is on your replacement animals. So that's where I would say that's where the real important change comes on keeping those herds that are negative long-term is testing in your gilts. The standard used to be ELISAs. We have moved again to straight up tracheal bronchial swabs in all of our animals. And we have actually caught one lateral break in finishing by doing that before we were moving it into a sow herd. Again, very rare to have a lateral break, but testing in your replacement animals is absolutely critical. And even doing a laryngeal swab, you're going to lose on a certain number of days. And mycoplasma does not move through a GDU, for example, at the rate that PRRS would. And so getting that wide, broad spread testing and getting detection as soon as possible so you can catch that movement, that's how you don't move it into the herd that you just spent all that money on eliminating it from.
Invest in diagnostics in the gilts. Make sure that they're negative before they come in.
Absolutely. As long as you're executing on the other biosecurity components, it's pretty unlikely you're going to move something in. For example, on a fomite, if you move it into your herds, it's typically been on gilts. Or I think everyone also needs to understand that if you completed an elimination within those 12 months post-elimination, even up to 18, you may still have those herds fall off, and it wasn't necessarily a lateral break, it was a failure to eliminate, and it just took you that long to detect the bug and for it to spread through your herd again.
All right. Well, pretty good discussion. Just a couple quick questions here before we move on to the final page. Your opinion on use of either processing fluids or oral fluids for mycoplasma high pneumonia. Different people have different perspectives on this. Be curious to learn what you think.
Sure. So let's take oral fluids question first. From an oral fluids perspective, it's an okay screening tool. If you're positive on oral fluids, you know you have a problem. But its ability to detect it both from a rapid standpoint as well as to detect a low prevalence is not good. So we will use it to go screen a finisher and a flow, for example, that, yep, if you're positive on oral fluids, oh boy, you're definitely positive. But if you're negative, it doesn't mean a whole lot. So I'd correlate it kind of to an ELISA test that it has its place and its tool from a screening perspective, but we don't use it very heavily because we're typically trying to catch things before you have a very high prevalence. From a processing fluid standpoint, we really have not utilized it very much. Again, we've really gone to mostly tracheobronchial swabs when we're trying to detect. It is useful from a standpoint that, again, if you have a herd that should be flat negative and you shouldn't find anything there, yeah, if you're positive, then you need to start looking and determining what's going on because you shouldn't find it. But again, the sensitivity on ability to pick up a low level and a prevalence and as well as timing of infection, I don't feel very strongly about that today. Would love to employ it because it's easier, much easier than doing a tracheobronchial swab, but boy, it just doesn't seem to get us the level of detection that we need.
So take home being, if I understand correctly, those are both population-based monitoring strategies for mycoplasma. They have low sensitivity, so perhaps they're good for screening. If you detect, you're better dive deeper, right? But it's just use them as a initial kind of screening.
Agree.
Screening program.
A very good initial screening to say, yep, check the box, I have a problem. Okay, now we have to go understand the problem a little bit deeper. Don't have high expectations that if there's a low prevalence, you may find it, and negative doesn't necessarily mean that you're not, negative doesn't mean a true negative on those tests. You need to go look deeper if you are negative and you're still questioning.
All right, thank you. What a great discussion. We do need to move on to the final page, which is about disease diagnosis. And long story short here, Giovanni, Edison, is that there's no signals, no increased detection of any specific pathogen or any specific disease syndrome. And the PRRS continues to lead the respiratory cases with 18% of the diagnosis there. The rotavirus is leading the enteric cases, and the streptozoa is leading the nervous system cases. Anything else to point on this disease diagnosis page?
No, we don't have anything else to point out here.
All right, that was about it that we have today. Thank you very much. Thanks again, Dr. Melissa Hens, for joining us for this discussion. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For a long, long time, I'm watching everything you do.